Usually when you talk about diagnosing a problem, there is this comforting expectation of precision.
Right.
Like if you break your arm, you go to the hospital, the X-ray shows that jagged white line on the screen,
Yeah.
and the doctor just points and says, that's the problem.
Yeah, it's very clean.
Exactly. It's clean, it's binary, and it's entirely visible.
And we rely so heavily on that visibility. I mean, as a society, we really like our reality to be categorized into neat, observable boxes, cause and effect, just right there on the table.
But then you step into fields like neurodevelopment or deep psychological trauma or even complex macroeconomics, and suddenly that X-ray machine is just completely useless.
Oh, totally useless.
They're looking at a diagnostic landscape where the lines are blurred, the symptoms overlap, and the root cause is like completely invisible to the naked eye.
Yeah.
It is the absolute definition of muddy water.
Yeah, it's a mess.
And that exact feeling, that profound shift from a world of clean, visible lines to a reality where the boundaries are totally permeable and everything is invisibly connected. That is exactly where we are taking you today. Welcome to The Deep Dive. Today we are exploring a concept we call a crisis in perception, where we examine the hidden systems shaping our world. I am so glad you're here with us.
It's a great topic today.
It really is. We are going to ask a question that might completely break your brain. What if the ancient myths you've always thought of as escapist fantasy or just primitive fairy tales were actually a highly sophisticated, mathematically precise governance system for reality itself?
It's a question that completely reframes how we consume history. I mean, think about how we're taught to look back at ancient cultures.
Right.
We're trained to separate their quote-unquote real history.
Like the kings and the farming.
Exactly. Their agricultural practices, trade routes, wars from their fake history, their gods, their magic, their taboos, the monsters. We put the farming in the history textbook, and we put the magic in the folklore section.
Yeah, we treat their mythology like it's the ancient equivalent of a Marvel movie. We just assume it was entertainment for people sitting around a campfire without Wi-Fi.
Right, just passing the time.
But I was recently reading Philip Freeman's incredibly detailed book, The Shining One, A Guide to Celtic Mythology, and it just hit me. We have been misdiagnosing an entire civilization. So our mission today for this deep dive is to look past that surface layer of magic and monsters.
We really have to.
We are going to analyze this ancient Celtic worldview not as a collection of quaint bedtime stories, but as a functional operating framework, like a legal, spiritual, and political system that dictated how people lived, ruled, and survived.
And to really understand this, we have to start by defining who the Celts actually were, because they weren't just a single, unified empire.
They weren't the Romans.
No, not at all. Historically, we're talking about a vast, decentralized collection of tribes sharing linguistic and cultural roots. They originated in Central Europe, areas around modern Austria and Switzerland, which was known as the Hallstatt and later Latin cultures, and they spread outward from there.
Wow, so a huge area.
Oh, massive. They spanned across Gaul, which is modern-day France, parts of the Iberian Peninsula, Britain, and of course Ireland. And the key thing is they didn't have a centralized emperor. They didn't have a Roman-style standing army or a sprawling bureaucracy.
Right.
And crucially, they didn't rely on written legal codes to govern their societies.
Which is just wild to think about. I mean, how do you maintain order across hundreds of thousands of people, across centuries, without writing down the laws?
It seems impossible to us.
It does. If you don't have a police force and you don't have a written constitution, what holds the society together? And the answer I found in the sources is what we're going to spend this deep dive unpacking. It basically relies on a concept of radical interdependence.
Yes.
This was not a society that separated church, state, and neighbor into neat little boxes. In our modern world, we have the government in one building, the church in another, and the environment is just like the raw material outside that we either manage or exploit.
Right, it's just a resource.
But in the Celtic worldview, kingship, law, honor, poetry, memory, and ecology were all structurally linked. They were literally woven together into a single, highly sensitive fabric of reality.
And that fabric was draped over a landscape that possessed what we can call permeable boundaries.
Permeable boundaries.
Yeah, that is the foundational concept you have to grasp to understand anything we're going to talk about today. The line between the human world and the divine world wasn't a solid brick wall. It was practically a revolving door.
Okay, I love that image.
They called this other realm the Cid, which translates roughly to the fairy mounds or the other world, but we have to totally discard our modern Christianized notions of heaven or hell here.
Right, it's not up in the sky.
Exactly. The Cid is not up in the clouds behind pearly gates, and it isn't a fiery pit deep underground.
It is an adjacent, overlapping reality. It occupies the exact same geographic space as the human world, just on a different frequency, and the entrances to it are physically present in the landscape. Like, you could walk right up to them.
You literally could.
The sources frequently mention places like the Brugg na Boyne, which we know today as the massive ancient passage tomb of Newgrange in Ireland.
Which is an incredible structure.
Unbelievable structure. This isn't just a pile of rocks. It's a spectacularly engineered Neolithic structure, older than the pyramids of Giza, aligned perfectly so that on the morning of the winter solstice, a single beam of sunlight pierces through a roof box and illuminates the inner chamber.
Right.
And to the Celts, this wasn't just an old grave. This was a literal, physical doorway into the other world. There was also the cave at Cruachan in the west of Ireland, famously known as the Gate to Hell.
Oh, that place is terrifying.
Right. You could stand at the mouth of this cave and feel the cold air blowing out from a reality that ran parallel to your own.
But what is vital to understand is that the other world isn't just a place where dead people go or, where magical beings hang out to play harps.
Right.
It is an active regulating force in the human world. It enforces the rules.
Okay, here is how I was thinking about it as I was reading the source material. Tell me if this analogy works for you.
Sure, let's hear it.
Think of the other world, the Cid, like the back-end code of a software program or an operating system.
Ooh, I like where this is going.
So you, as the user, are clicking around on the user interface. That's the human world. You see the buttons, you see the images, you see the landscape. You don't see the ones and zeros. You don't see the code.
Right, it's invisible to you.
But that invisible back-end code dictates absolutely everything happening on your screen. And if you, the user, try to do something that violates the core rules of the back-end code, like if you try to force the system to do something it wasn't programmed to tolerate, the system crashes.
You get a fatal error.
Exactly, you get an error message. Or, in the case of the Celts, you get horrific supernatural intervention.
That is a perfect framework for this. Really perfect. And those error messages could be incredibly violent and terrifying.
Yeah, they were not messing around.
Not at all. To see exactly how this back-end code enforced the mundane rules of the user interface, we have to look at a chilling story from the sources, which is The Adventure of Nera.
Oh, man. This story is so incredibly atmospheric. It takes place at the festival of Samhain, which we know today as the ancient Celtic root of Halloween.
Right.
And Samhain occurs at the exact midpoint between the autumn equinox and the winter solstice. It is the beginning of the dark half of the year. And in the Celtic calendar, this wasn't just a changing of the seasons. It was the moment when the boundary between the human world and the other world completely dropped. The veil was lifted.
To use your analogy, Samhain is the night the back-end code suddenly becomes visible on the screen.
Yes, the firewall is down.
Exactly. The forces of the Cid can walk freely into the human domain, and humans can easily wander into the other world. It is a time of immense supernatural danger.
So we find King Ailill and Queen Medb of Connaught, who are two massive figures in Irish mythology, in their royal fortress at Cruachan, the very same place with that terrifying cave.
Right, the gate to hell.
Yep. It's the midnight. It is pitch black outside. And they had just hanged 2 prisoners the day before. The bodies are still swinging from the gallows outside the fortress.
So grim.
Very grim. Ailill, sitting comfortably by the fire, offers a challenge to his warriors. He says that whoever is brave enough to go out into the pitch-black night and tie a supple twig around the foot of one of the dead, hanged prisoners will get a massive reward. He even offers his own gold-hilted sword.
Now, on the surface, this just sounds like a standard macho dare.
Right, like a fraternity prank.
Exactly. But you have to remember the context. Every single warrior in that hall is terrified. They are completely fearless in battle against other men, but going outside on some main night is practically a death sentence.
Because the back end is leaking into the UI.
Right. The spirits of the dead and the horrific forces of chaos are actively roaming the earth. But finally, a young warrior named Nera stands up and says, I'll do it. I'll take the dare.
Nera walks out into the dark. He finds the gallows. The wind is howling. He reaches up and tries to tie the twig around the dead man's foot. He tries it once, and the twig snaps off. He tries it twice, and it falls. He tries it a third time, and it won't hold. And then out of the darkness, the corpse speaks to him.
I really love the absolute deadpan delivery of the source text here.
It's so funny.
The dead man simply chimes in with practical advice. He tells Nira that the twig will never hold unless he puts a special wooden spike into it.
Nira, who is probably out of his mind with terror but fully committed to the bit, does exactly what the corpse says. He puts the spike in, and the twig holds. But then the dead man says, "Hey, by your honor as a warrior, you owe me a favor. I was terribly thirsty when I was executed. Carry me on your back to get a drink of water."
And here we see the first binding mechanism of the society in action, which is the warrior's honor.
Right.
Nira cannot refuse a request made upon his honor, even from a talking corpse on the most dangerous night of the year. So he agrees. He literally throws a dead, hanged man onto his back and starts walking through the dark to find the nearest house.
They approach the first house in the village, but as they get close, they realize they can't enter. The house is completely surrounded by a massive, supernatural lake of fire.
Which is wild.
Totally wild. The dead man looks at it and says, "My drink is not here. The hearth is always properly raked in this house. The fire is safely banked for the night. Move on to the next."
And keep a pin in that phrase. The hearth is always properly raked, because they move on to the second house. But this one is surrounded by a supernatural lake of water.
Okay.
The dead man says, do not go to that house either. There is never any dirty water left in the tubs there after washing and bathing. They always throw it out, move on to the next.
So Nira, still carrying the corpse, walks to a third house. This house has no lake of fire. It has no lake of water. They walk right through the front door. The inhabitants are fast asleep.
Bad news for them.
Very bad news. The dead man climbs down, wanders over to the corner, and finds massive tubs full of unemptied dirty bath water and washing water. He drinks deeply from them. And then he turns toward the sleeping family, and he spits a mouthful of that dirty water directly onto their faces.
Ugh.
And the family instantly drops dead. Nira then carries the corpse back to the gallows, hangs him back up, and returns to the king.
Now, we really need to unpack this deeply, because if you just read this as a surface narrative, it is a spooky ghost story to tell around a campfire. It has zombies, lakes of fire, supernatural murder.
It's a great horror movie pitch.
Yeah, exactly. But if we apply our systems analysis to it, this myth is doing incredibly heavy lifting for societal regulation.
Right. Because what was actually protecting those first two houses, it wasn't a magic spell, it wasn't a druid's ward, it was mundane domestic hygiene.
Yes.
Raking the hearth fire before you go to sleep so a stray spark doesn't catch the thatched roof and burn down the entire wooden village. Emptying your dirty bathwater so bacteria and disease don't fester in your living space.
In a tribal society living in close quarters, a fire or a plague could wipe out the entire community in days. They didn't have a centralized health department to inspect homes. They didn't have a fire marshal issuing fines.
So how do you ensure compliance?
You encode these critical survival behaviors into the back-end reality. The supernatural horror, the lakes of fire, the murderous undead, is deployed as a law enforcement mechanism.
Yeah.
The other world enforces mundane domestic law.
If you do your chores, the system grants you a supernatural firewall. If you leave your dirty bathwater out, the system removes your firewall and the forces of the Cid will literally murder you in your sleep. It is a truth engine. Magic is being used as a highly practical tool to regulate social behavior and ensure the survival of the collective.
And that concept of supernatural regulation extended far beyond the domestic sphere. It went all the way up to the very top of the social hierarchy.
Right, to the kings.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The other world didn't just care about your bathwater, it cared deeply about political legitimacy and the behavior of the king.
Which brings us to a really fascinating concept, which is the king as an ecological node. When we think of a king today, or even a medieval European king, we think of the guy who controls the military, collects the taxes, makes the laws, the guy with the biggest army.
The political leader.
Right. But in the Celtic system, the king was literally physically wired into the landscape. His personal morality and physical perfection directly controlled the weather, the crops, and the fertility of the land.
This is the ancient concept of sacral kingship. The body politic is not a metaphor, it is literalized in the body of the king. The system operated on a principle called fyrflathamon, which translates to the ruler's truth, or the justice of the king.
The ruler's truth.
Yes. If the king acts with honor, generosity, and justice, the physical environment responds with abundance. If the king is flawed, unjust, or ungenerous, the environment crashes.
The ultimate systemic feedback loop. The sources provide us with two perfectly contrasting examples of this dynamic in action. First, let's look at the example of a false king. This takes us back to the Liber Gabala Éireann, the Book of Invasions, which details the mythological history of Ireland.
Which is a fascinating text.
Truly,
Yeah.
there is a magical, divine race that rules Ireland called the Tuatha De Danann. They are essentially the pantheon of Celtic gods. Their king is a great leader named Nuadu, but during a massive battle, Nuadu's arm is severed by an enemy warrior.
And within the logic of this system, that single injury triggers a constitutional crisis.
Just because of his arm.
Yes, because a king must be physically unblemished. A blemish on the king's body represents a blemish on the sovereignty of the land itself. You cannot have a maimed node connecting to the ecology. So even though Nuadu was a good leader, he is legally forced to abdicate the throne. Now, a physician named Denain Cecht eventually crafts him a fully functional arm made of solid silver, earning him the title Nuadu Ergetlam, or Nuadu of the Silver Arm. But in the meantime, the Tuatha De Danann need a new king.
So they decide to give the kingship to a strikingly beautiful warrior named Bress. Now, Bress's lineage is really important here. He is half Tuatha De Danann and half Fomorian.
Right, and we need to clarify who the Fomorians are. While the Tuatha De Danann represent art, skill, and order, the Fomorians are a race of beings who live under the sea or under the earth.
Like the dark mirrors of the gods.
Basically, yeah. They represent the chaotic, destructive, and blighting forces of nature. They are the frost that kills the crops, the storm that sinks the ships.
So Bress looks the part of a perfect king. He is physically flawless. The text says every beautiful thing in Ireland was compared to him. But the moment he takes power, his Fomorian nature takes over. He is incredibly greedy and completely ungenerous.
Which is a huge problem.
A massive problem. In Celtic society, hospitality isn't just being polite. It is a sacred, load-bearing pillar of the economy and social order. A king must redistribute wealth. He must throw lavish feasts.
But the source text is incredibly specific about Bress's failures. It explicitly states that under his rule, the knives of his people were not greased with the fat of his feasts.
That's such a great detail.
Isn't it? Their breath did not smell of his ale. There was no music played in his halls, no bards reciting poetry, no acrobats. He hoarded everything. He even forced the greatest, most legendary warriors of the Tuatha De Danann, men like Ogma and the Dagda, to do menial labor, like hauling firewood and digging trenches.
He totally violated the sacred obligation of reciprocity. In a modern corporate sense, he was a terrible CEO who cut all the employee benefits, hoarded the profits, and made the senior engineers clean the bathrooms.
Exactly.
But in the Celtic system, bad leadership doesn't just mean a dip in the polls or a worker strike. Because Bress failed his systemic obligations, the back-end code reacted. The physical environment rejected him.
It actively fought back.
Yeah, the crops withered in the fields. The cows stopped giving milk. The people starved. Bad leadership literally created cosmic disorder. The land itself recognized that his ruler's truth was false, and it initiated a systemic shutdown.
Now, contrast that terrifying collapse with the exact opposite scenario. Later in the myths, we meet a mortal king named Conaire Mór. We will discuss exactly how he becomes king a bit later, but for now, let's look at what happens when a true king takes the throne.
When Conaire begins his reign, the text gives us this beautiful, almost utopian description of ecological perfection.
It's very poetic.
It says that the ships bringing goods from overseas have perfectly calm waters. The oak trees drop so many acorns that the pigs are feasting on piles of them up to a man's knees.
That's a lot of acorns.
A lot of fat pigs. The rivers are so teeming with fish you can barely see the water. The weather is flawless. Like from spring to autumn, not a single gust of wind blows hard enough to disturb a cow's tail. And most importantly, no man slays another in his realm. To use our analogy, the UI is running at maximum efficiency because the user is perfectly obeying the back-end code.
It really makes you realize how deeply, inextricably interconnected their view of reality was. You cannot separate the economy from the morality of the leader. You cannot separate the weather from the justice of the courts. The king is the linchpin holding the seen and unseen worlds in balance.
But this brings up a vital question.
Okay.
If the physical world and the other world are linked by the behavior of the king, and the system is so delicate that a bad king can ruin the harvest, how is this complex structure actually managed day to day? Like, if you are a citizen or a warrior or a judge, how do you communicate with this system? How do you enforce the rules without a standing police force?
You do it through the most powerful causal tool in the entire Celtic arsenal, which is the spoken word.
Which brings us to a fascinating concept we can call the truth engine. When we think of ancient Celtic warriors, our minds immediately go to broad swords, massive shields, war chariots, sheer physical brutality.
Yeah, the typical barbarian image.
Exactly. But the Celts firmly believed that verbal power actually superseded military power. And there's a story from the historical sources that illustrates this beautifully. It comes from Lucian, a Greek satirist and writer who traveled extensively through the Roman Empire, including the region of Gaul, in the 2nd century AD.
Oh, the story of Ogmios.
Yes.
It provides one of the most striking visual metaphors in all of classical literature regarding the Celts.
Lucian writes that he was traveling in Gaul when he came across a depiction of a Hercules. Now, as a Greek, Lucian knows exactly what Hercules is supposed to look like, right? A young, phenomenally muscular, absolute unit of a demigod holding a massive club and wearing a lion skin.
The standard hero template?
Right. But the Gauls called their version of this god Ogmios. And this local depiction wasn't a young, muscular brute at all. It was a bald, deeply wrinkled, sun-baked old man. He had the lion skin and the club, so Lucian knew it was meant to be Hercules, but he looked frail.
But here is where the imagery gets profoundly interesting. Lucian looks closer at the painting. This old, bald Hercules is dragging a massive crowd of men behind him. And these men aren't tied by their hands or shackled by their feet. They are bound by incredibly delicate, beautiful chains made of gold and amber.
And where are these chains attached?
They are attached directly to the ears of the crowd.
That is so weird.
And the other end of the chains, all of them are attached directly to the tongue of Ogmios. He is pulling this massive crowd forward by his tongue, and Lucian notes a crucial detail. The men being pulled are smiling.
They're happy about it.
They look happy to follow him. The chains are delicate. They could easily break them and run away, but they don't want to. They are captivated.
Lucian naturally is completely confused by this. He thinks someone is playing a joke on the Greek god. But a local Gaul who speaks Greek steps up and explains the theology to him. The Gaul says that unlike the Greeks, the Celts do not believe that physical strength is the ultimate expression of power. To the Celts, the ultimate power, the power that can move mountains, topple kings, and lead armies, is eloquence. It is the spoken word. And they depict him as an old man specifically because true eloquence, wisdom, and rhetorical mastery reach their absolute peak in old age, not in the physical prime of youth.
That visual is just incredible. The golden chains of speech connecting the tongue to the ear, it tells you everything you need to know about how they viewed language.
It really does.
In our modern Western framework, we think of speech as merely descriptive. When we talk, we are just pointing at reality and describing it. You know, the sky is blue, the table is hard, the words are separate from the object. But in the Celtic system, speech is causal. It is embedded directly into the structure of reality. The words literally make things happen.
And this brings us to the most feared and respected figures in Celtic society, the Philid or the poets. We need to totally erase the modern image of a poet as a starving artist writing sonnets in a cafe, or even just a bard strumming a harp in the corner of a royal feast.
Oh, absolutely.
The Philid were the intellectual, legal, and magical elite of the society. Their training was unimaginably rigorous. It could take up to 12 years of study, often conducted in completely dark rooms, memorizing hundreds of complex tales, genealogies, legal precedents, and specific meters of incantation. They were the regulators of status and reality itself.
They wielded two primary weapons, both of which were verbal, praise and satire. Praise was highly sought after. A poet's praise could elevate a king to mythic status, cementing his political legitimacy and ensuring his fame would outlast his physical life.
But satire?
Satire was feared far worse than a physical blade.
Because, as we established, speech is causal. Satire wasn't just a clever insult or a political cartoon. It was a magical curse that altered reality.
The sources give us a fantastic example of this involving the legendary hero Finn McCumhale.
Oh, I love this one.
In his younger days, Finn is essentially living as an outlaw in the woods. He gets into a dispute with a powerful local lord because Finn's hounds killed a magnificent stag and Finn took the meat for himself.
Classic outlaw behavior.
Right. The Lord is furious. He tracks Finn down in the forest, but when he confronts this young outlaw, the Lord doesn't draw his sword. He doesn't threaten to chop Finn's head off.
No, the Lord looks at him and says, "I will not take revenge on you now with violence, but I will have my poets satirize you to the worth of 100 stags."
He threatens to nuke Finn's reputation with poetry.
Literally nuke it.
And in a society where your honor and your reputation are literal physical currency, which we will detail shortly, a poet's satire could completely destroy your life. There are myths where a poet's satire is so potent that it literally causes red boils to break out on a king's face.
And remember the rule of sacred kingship. A king with a physical blemish can no longer rule.
Exactly. Therefore, a poet could literally depose a sitting king without ever lifting a weapon, simply by reciting a perfectly crafted, magically charged poem mocking him.
Okay, here's my analogy for the ancient Celtic poet. Imagine a single person who embodies the power of a Supreme Court justice, the anchor of a major primetime news network, and a walking nuclear deterrent.
That's a powerful combination.
That is a Philly. They interpret and hold the law, they broadcast your status to the entire known world, and if you cross them, they will drop a verbal bomb that ends your political, social, and physical existence.
That is a highly accurate assessment of their role. And their words didn't just affect human politics, their words interacted directly with the landscape itself. We see this vividly in the story of Emergen, the chief poet and druid of Milesians.
Let's set the stage for this one. The Milesians, who represent the Gaelic ancestors of the modern Irish, are sailing to Ireland to conquer it. But Ireland is currently occupied by the magical Tuatha Dé Danann. As the Milesian fleet approaches the shore, the Tuatha Dé Danann druids summon a massive magical storm to push the ships back out to sea and destroy them. The winds are howling, the waves are crashing, the fleet is in absolute peril.
But Emergen steps forward. As his right foot touches the shore of Ireland for the first time, he doesn't plant a flag to claim the territory in the name of a distant king. He doesn't draw a sword and scream a battle cry. He recites a poem.
He speaks an incantation, and the words are mesmerizing. He says, "I am a wind upon the ocean. I am a wave upon the land. I am the roaring of the sea. I am a stag of 7 tines. I am a hawk upon the cliff. I am a teardrop of the sun. I am the fairest of plants. I am a wild boar in valor. I am a salmon in the pool. I am a lake in the plain."
It's beautiful.
It goes on, identifying himself intimately with every element of the natural world.
And this is not just pretty verse. This is a profound legal and metaphysical claiming of the territory. By identifying himself with the elemental system itself, he is hacking the back-end code of the island. He isn't saying, "I conquer this land." He is saying, "I am this land."
Wow.
He is establishing his sovereignty through the causal power of speech. And the text notes that as soon as he finishes the incantations, the magical storms summoned by the Tuatha Dé Danann immediately die down. The land itself recognizes the authority of his words and submits to the new reality he has spoken into existence.
So words have immense literal weight. But reading all this raised a massive logistical question for me. If words are this powerful, and warriors are highly sensitive to insults, and everyone's honor is constantly on the line, how does this society not just instantly collapse into a bloody, chaotic free-for-all? Like if every poet has a nuclear deterrent and every warrior is itching to prove his bravery, what stops the bombs from flying and the swords from swinging every single day?
That is the fundamental problem of any honor-based society. If an insult demands blood and blood demands revenge, you get an endless cycle of blood feuds that will eventually wipe out the entire tribe.
Right.
So a society built on honor and magical vengeance needs an incredibly robust braking mechanism. It needs systemic friction to prevent collapse. And the Celts managed this through incredibly strict, meticulously calculated systems of wealth, status, and what they called honor price.
Let's unpack the mechanics of honor price. In Old Irish, it's called loganach, which literally translates to the price of one's face.
Exactly. Every single person in the society, from the high king at Tara down to the lowest slave, had a specific, quantifiable legal value assigned to their status. This value was usually calculated in units of cattle or ounces of silver or cumals, which originally meant female slaves, but later became a standard unit of value.
So if you insulted someone, injured them, or even killed them, you didn't usually go to a state-run prison. The Celts didn't really have prisons. Instead, you were legally obligated to pay their honor price to them or their family. It is a system built entirely on material restitution rather than state punishment.
And the sources give us a fantastic, slightly absurd story about how far this system of restitution went, involving a notorious poet named Athern and a young prodigy named Emergen. And just to clarify, this is a different Emergen than the poet who claimed Ireland.
Right, different guy. Yeah. Athern is the chief poet of Ulster. He is legendary for being incredibly greedy, arrogant, and cruel. He uses his power of satire to basically extort kings and lords for wealth. One day, Athern hears a rumor. A local blacksmith has a young son named Emergen. The boy hasn't spoken a single word for the first 14 years of his life. But one day, out of nowhere, the boy suddenly speaks a perfect, incredibly complex, cryptic poem.
The blacksmith father immediately panics because he knows the brutal politics of the Philid. If Etherne, the chief poet, finds out that there is a young boy with poetic skills that might rival or surpass his own, Etherne will kill the boy to protect his own monopoly on status.
So the father comes up with a plan. He makes a life-size clay dummy of the boy, covers it in blankets, and puts it in the boy's bed. And sure enough, in the dead of night, Etherne sneaks into the house with a heavy axe, walks up to the bed, and brings the axe down, chopping the head off the clay dummy, fully believing he has just murdered the child prodigy.
It's so dark.
Father jumps out, raises the alarm, and Etherne is captured by the locals.
Now, in our modern society, the attempted premeditated murder of a child is going to get you locked in a penitentiary for the rest of your life.
Oh, absolutely.
But let's look at how the ancient judges of Ulster handle it.
They don't imprison him. They put him on trial and they fine him. The judges force Etherne to pay the blacksmith the value of 7 slave women plus the blacksmith's own honor price as restitution for the crime. But the real genius of the system is the second half of the judgment.
This is the best part.
They don't ganish Etherne. They force him to take the young boy, Emergen, as his own apprentice and legally compel him to teach the boy all his poetic arts.
That is brilliant systemic engineering. The system doesn't just extract a fine, it forces social integration. It takes a violently toxic rivalry that could have started a blood feud, and it legally binds the two parties together in a mentorship. The system prioritizes restitution and the transfer of knowledge over endless retaliation and isolation.
It's about maintaining equilibrium at all costs. But of course, honor price was just the legal back end of the system. The social reality of status was managed much more publicly and violently. Status wasn't a static number you just kept in a bank account. It had to be constantly defended, asserted, and audited in front of your peers.
Right.
And the primary mechanism for auditing status was the boasting contest.
Which brings us to one of the most revealing and darkly comedic stories in the entire mythology, the story of Macduth's pig.
This is one of my absolute favorites. It is hilarious, it is brutal, and it perfectly illustrates the psychology of the Celtic warrior elite. Let me set the stage. Macduth is a relatively minor king who happened to own a phenomenal legendary hound dog named Ailo. The dog is so incredibly fast and skilled at hunting that news of it spreads across the island.
It's a very famous dog.
Extremely famous. Eventually, both King Conchobar of the province of Ulster and King Ailill and Queen Med of the rival province of Connacht decide they want the dog.
And through a stroke of terrible luck, the messengers from Ulster and the messengers from Connacht arrive at Macduth's door on the exact same day, demanding to buy the dog for their respective monarchs.
Macduth is absolutely terrified. He is caught between two superpowers. If he gives the dog to Ulster, the army of Connacht will march over and burn his kingdom to the ground. If he gives the dog to Connacht, the army of Ulster will destroy him. He doesn't know what to do, so his wife gives him a devious piece of advice. She says, tell them both yes.
Classic mistake.
Right. So he privately tells the Ulster messengers, the dog is yours, come pick it up on this specific day. And he tells the Connacht messengers, the dog is yours, come pick it up on the exact same day.
It is a recipe for an explosion. He deliberately invites the two most powerful, heavily armed, fiercely rivalrous armies in Ireland to his great hall at the exact same time.
Yes. The day arrives. The warriors of Ulster and the warriors of Connacht march into the great hall. The tension is thick enough to cut with a sword. They're glaring at each other across the room. To feed this massive, dangerous crowd, Macduth slaughters his prize pig. And this isn't just any pig. The text emphasizes its absurd proportions. It took 60 cows to feed this pig for 7 years.
That is a massive pig.
It is huge. The roasted pig is carried into the center of the great hall, and immediately a highly volatile question arises. Who gets to carve the pig?
This revolves around the sacred tradition of the champion's portion. In Celtic feast culture, the greatest warrior in the room gets the honor of taking the first, choicest cut of meat. It is the ultimate display of status. But to claim the champion's portion, you have to publicly prove you are the best man in the room and dare anyone to contradict you.
So a warrior named Set of Connacht stands up. Set is a massive, battle-scarred, terrifying veteran. He walks to the center of the hall, stands over the steaming pig, pulls out his knife, and challenges anyone from Ulster to stop him from carving it. And this kicks off the greatest boasting contest in literature. One by one, the heroes of Ulster stand up and say, I am a better man than you, Set. Step away from the pig. And one by one, Set verbally destroys them.
But he doesn't just call them names. He performs a public audit of their physical history. He uses their own scars against them.
Exactly. It is a public ledger of violence. Loegr stands up. Set looks at him and says, "Sit down, Loegr. Don't you remember when you first took up arms? You crossed the border into Connacht and I met you there. I threw a lance straight through your chest. You ran away, leaving your weapons behind." Loegr sits down in shame. Then a warrior named Eogan stands up. Set laughs and says, "Sit down, Eogan. Don't you remember when I raided your farm to steal your cattle? You threw a spear at me and I caught it out of the air and threw it right back, tearing out your eye. You've had one eye ever since." Eogan sits down.
And he just keeps going down the line.
He does this to like 6 guys. He reminds Kelcher that he threw a spear through his thighs, mutilating him so he can't have children. He reminds men that he literally chopped off his heel, leaving him with a limp. He reminds Cumscrade that he pierced his throat in battle, which is why Cumscrade speaks with a stutter. He uses their permanent physical disabilities as receipts of his superiority.
It reads like a dark, violent comedy. But again, we must ask, why is this happening? This isn't just drunken macho posturing in a bar. In a culture where reputation is currency and fame outlasts physical life, this is an official accounting procedure.
That makes a lot of sense.
Honor and violence are being publicly tallied to maintain the strict hierarchy of the system. Every single person in that hall is watching. They now know exactly where Loegr, Eogan, and Kelcher stand in relation to Set. The hierarchy is reestablished through verbal accounting.
Right. And Set is about to carve the pig, having shamed the entire province of Ulster. Until suddenly, the doors to the hall burst open, and in walks Conall Cernach, the ultimate undefeated champion of Ulster.
And the dynamic in the room shifts instantly.
Conall strides up to the pig. He looks at Set and tells him to step away. Conall says, "Since the day I first took up a spear, I have not passed a single day without killing a Connacht warrior, nor have I slept a single night without the severed head of a Connacht fighter under my knee."
The cult of the head, once again, the ultimate trophy.
And astonishingly, Set actually concedes. Set says, "It is true, Conall, you are a better warrior than I am. I yield the pig to you. But if my older brother Anluan were here, he would challenge you. He is a better man than you, and it is a shame he is not here to defend Connacht's honor."
And this is where the public audit reaches its absolute peak of visceral drama.
Conall smiles and says, "Oh, but he is here." And Conall reaches into his leather satchel, pulls out the freshly severed head of Anluan, and throws it with such force that it smashes directly into Set's chest, covering him in his own brother's blood.
Brutal.
Set stumbles back, horrified and defeated, and Conall sits down and carves the pig.
It is intensely violent. But look at it from a systems perspective. The dispute is settled. The ledger is perfectly balanced. Conall produced the literal, undeniable receipt of his superiority. The hierarchy is established without the two armies having to slaughter each other in the hall, and the feast can commence. The boasting contest prevented a massacre by formalizing the conflict.
But speaking of ledgers and balance, we have to talk about the ultimate audit of wealth in these myths, the famous pillow talk scene. This is the prologue that kicks off the greatest, longest epic of Irish mythology, the Tainbo Cuinge, or the Cattle Raid of Cooley.
Yes. This scene takes place between Queen Med and her husband King Ailill of Connacht, the same rulers who hosted Nera on Samain.
They are lying in bed one night, and they start having a seemingly petty argument over who is wealthier. Med says she brought more wealth into the marriage. Ailill says no, his wealth is far greater. The argument gets so heated that they literally get out of bed, wake up their servants, and order all of their personal possessions to be brought out into the courtyard and counted side by side.
And they count everything. They count their wooden buckets, their iron pots, their gold rings, their purple cloaks, their flocks of sheep, their herds of horses, their pigs, and finally, the ultimate measure of Celtic wealth, their cattle.
And it turns out, after this exhaustive audit, they are exactly perfectly equal in every single category of wealth, except for one tiny detail. Among Ailill's herds, there is one phenomenal, magically potent white bull named Finn Benach. Med looks through her herds, and she realizes she does not have a bull that equals Finn Benach. And because of this one single missing bull, Med mobilizes the entire army of Connacht, allies with other provinces, and launches a massive, bloody cross-country war to march on Ulster and steal the famous brown bull of Quaint, just so she can match her husband.
Which naturally leads to a very modern pushback.
Right. I read this, and my immediate reaction was, this is incredibly petty. An epic, bloody war that devastates two entire provinces, leaving thousands dead, All starts because Allele has one magic white bull that Med doesn't have. It's really just a story about female vanity, greed, and ego.
If we look at it through the lens of modern psychology, yes, it looks exactly like toxic ego and marital pettiness. But we must reframe this through the systemic lens of the Celtic worldview. This is actually a story about institutional legitimacy. You have to understand who Met is.
Okay.
She is not just a human queen who married well. She is a sovereignty figure. She explicitly states in the text her requirements for a husband. He must be a man with no fear, no meanness, and no jealousy. Why? Because she is a goddess-like representation of the land itself.
Ah.
She is the sovereignty of Connacht personified.
Exactly. Her name, Medb, literally translates to she who intoxicates, related to mead, the drink of sovereignty given to a true king. If she is outwealthy by her husband, her political power is structurally destabilized. In this system, wealth equals status, and status equals the right to rule.
Wow.
If Allele has the superior bull, he is functionally the superior ruler, and Med becomes subordinate. For Med, the pursuit of the brown bull of Quelinch isn't an act of petty jealousy. It is a necessary, urgent, systemic rebalancing of power. It is a constitutional crisis. If she accepts being lesser in wealth, the entire hierarchy of her rule collapses. She must acquire the brown bull to restore the balance of sovereignty.
Wow. Okay, that completely changes how you read the entire epic. It's not a tantrum. It's a desperate attempt to maintain political equilibrium. So we've seen how external status was managed by wealth, by cattle, by boasting contests, and by honor price. But what about internal control? How do you control an individual who is so powerful, so exalted in this system, that no army or fine can stop them? You bind them with Jessa. Which brings us to a fascinating mechanism of internal discipline.
Let's unpack the concept of Jessa, the singular being Geis. A Geis is a sacred prohibition, a magical taboo placed on a specific individual.
We saw this concept briefly with King Conair earlier. Conair Mór, the true king whose reign brought perfect weather, abundant acorns, and absolute peace to Ireland. The source text, the destruction of Dideriga's hostel, tells us exactly how he became king and the immense cost of that power.
Conair is a young man, driving his chariot toward the royal center of Tara. Along the way, a magical, supernatural being, a birdman named Nemglan, appears to him. Nemglan tells Conair that it's his destiny to be the High King of Ireland. But the birdman places 9 incredibly specific, bizarre Jessa on him, taboos that he must never break, or his reign will end in blood.
Let's list a few of these Jessa because their sheer specificity is the point of the exercise.
Okay, the birdman says, you must never harm a bird. You must never pass right-hand-wise around the royal hill of Tara. You must not hunt the crooked beasts of Cerna. You must not allow 3 red men to go before you into a red man's house. You must not allow a lone man or woman to visit your dwelling after sunset. And you must not try to settle a quarrel between 2 of your own slaves.
Now, when a modern reader looks at that list, what is the immediate reaction?
It sounds like an OCD fever dream. Why would a highly sophisticated governance system impose such arbitrary, random-sounding rules on its most important executive? Don't follow 3 red men to a red house. It seems like superstitious nonsense.
But look at what these rules actually do to the psychology of the king. They impose severe internal discipline. They create constant daily friction.
Right.
In a world where a high king has absolute life or death power over his subjects, where no police force can arrest him, the Jessa are the checks and balances. They force the most powerful individual in society to constantly monitor his own behavior. He has to stay hyper-aware of his surroundings, his company, the time of day, and his travel routes.
It prevents him from acting on pure, unchecked impulse. He can't just ride his chariot wherever he wants without thinking. He can't just invite anyone he wants to his fire after dark. He can't just capriciously judge his slaves. His identity and his survival are intrinsically tied to his obedience to these taboos. He is bound.
They are the friction that keeps a highly powerful individual grounded. And the myth of Conair shows us, with tragic precision, exactly what happens when the societal order breaks down around him.
Right, because the tragedy of Conair isn't that he wakes up one day and decides to rebel against the gods. He doesn't break these rules on purpose. He is forced into a cascade of breaking his Jessa because he makes one fatal moral error regarding his family.
Walk us through how the collapse happens.
Conair has 3 foster brothers. They grew up together, and Conair loves them deeply. But his foster brothers grow up to be essentially ancient mobsters, known as marauders. They steal cattle, they raid farms, they beat people up, specifically to test the system and see if their brother, the king, will dare to punish them. The nobles of Ireland capture the marauders and bring them to Conair for judgment. The law is clear. They should be exiled or executed. But Conaire, out of love for his foster brothers, looks the other way. He judges that the other raiders should be killed, but he spares his brothers.
He fails his primary sacred duty as a sacral king, to uphold absolute impartial justice. The fur flaphemon, the ruler's truth, is corrupted by nepotism.
And the exact moment he fails that moral duty, the back-end code activates to destroy him. The land falls into chaos. War bands, led by those very same exile foster brothers, return and start burning the farms of Ireland. Conaire rides out in his chariot to try and stop the chaos, but in the smoke and confusion of the war, he accidentally travels right-hand-wise around Tara. Guy's broken.
One down.
He gets lost and hunts some beasts along the way for food, only to find out later they were the magical crooked beasts of Cerna. Guy's broken. Seeking shelter from the chaos, he rides toward a large hostel. But as he approaches, he sees 3 men dressed entirely in red clothing, riding red horses, going into the hostel ahead of him. Guy's broken.
The broken taboos are the mechanism of his doom. The universe is orchestrating his destruction because he allowed injustice to fester. The Jessa act as the tripwires of fate. Once the system detects corruption at the central node, the king, it triggers the Jessa to remove him from the board. He is trapped in that hostel, surrounded by his enemies, consumed by supernatural thirst, and ultimately killed.
Which is deeply tragic, but it shows how the system regulates itself. You cannot cheat the back-end code. Now, in that story, the catalyst for the tragedy was Conaire's foster brothers. And that concept of fosterage is another massive pillar of their social architecture that we need to explore.
Fosterage was essential to Celtic society. Children, especially the children of the nobility and the elite, were rarely raised exclusively by their biological parents. At a young age, they were sent away to be raised by other noble families, or by druids, or by expert warriors.
The book highlights this beautifully with the birth of a boy named Setanta, who will grow up to be the most famous, unstoppable warrior in all of Irish myth, Cuchulainn. When Setanta is born, he is clearly marked for greatness, and the greatest nobles of Ulster actually gather around and argue over who gets the honor of fostering him.
King Conserbar says, "I am the king, my sister is his mother, he should be raised in my royal household." But then Bracrú, a warrior known for his sharp tongue and troublemaking, stirs the pot. He says no one is worthy. Then Sencha, the chief judge of Ulster, steps up and says, "I should raise the boy because I can teach him eloquence, wisdom, and the law."
Makes sense.
Then Blay, an incredibly wealthy landowner, says, "I should raise him because I have the resources to feed him and protect him from any enemy." Then Fergus MacRoach, the greatest veteran warrior, says, "I should raise him because I can teach him martial skills and how to survive in battle."
They bring this intense argument to the wise judge Sencha to resolve. And what does he decide? How do they avoid offending any of these powerful men?
Sencha decides that they should all foster him.
He decrees that multiple people will train the boy, one for wisdom, one for wealth, one for martial skill, one for royal bearing.
What is fascinating here is the deliberate social engineering. Fosterage distributes skill, loyalty, and social cohesion across multiple competing households. Think about it. If I raise your son in my house for 10 years and you raise my daughter in your house, our families are now deeply emotionally bonded. We are far less likely to go to war with each other over a border dispute or a stolen cow.
You are weaving an incredibly tight social fabric. Instead of narrow, isolated royal bloodlines consolidating power in one castle and plotting against everyone else, you create a warrior sage elite that is trained through multiple relational networks. Cuchulainn isn't just loyal to his biological father. He is deeply emotionally bonded to the king, the chief judge, the wealthiest landowner, and the greatest general. He is the ultimate product of the collective system. If you attack one of his foster fathers, you attack him.
Exactly. It creates a web of mutual defense. But this tightly wound system, with its strict honor prices, its fatal Jessa, and its deeply entangled fosterage networks, it is essentially a pressure cooker. It requires everyone to play their part perfectly.
Yeah.
And that brings us to the inevitable question. What happens when the individuals within the system give in to their personal selfish desires?
The predictable outcome is absolute catastrophe. The system fractures. And the prime example of this is one of the most famous and heartbreaking stories in all of Celtic mythology, the tragedy of Deirdre and the sons of Guislu.
This story is the Celtic equivalent of Helen of Troy, but with much deeper systemic implications.
A girl named Deirdre is born to the storyteller of King Conchobar's court. At the feast celebrating her birth, the chief druid Cathbad goes into a trance and prophesies. He says that this baby girl will grow up to be breathtakingly beautiful, the most beautiful woman in Ireland, but that her beauty will bring blood, death, exile, and absolute ruin to the province of Ulster.
That's a heavy prophecy.
Upon hearing this, the warriors in the room draw their swords. They say, "Kill the baby now. Protect the province." But King Conchobar, looking at the child, makes a fateful decision. He says, "No, I will not kill her. I will take her away, raise her in total isolation in the forest with only a nursemaid, and when she is old enough, I will marry her myself."
Here we see the first crack in the system. King Conchobar is placing his personal desire and his ego above the safety of the collective. The truth engine, the Druid's prophecy, warned him of the systemic threat, and he ignored it out of lust and arrogance.
Deirdre grows up hidden away in the forest, and as prophesied, she is stunningly beautiful. But she doesn't want to marry the old king. One winter day, she sees a raven drinking the blood of a slaughtered calf in the snow. She tells her nursemaid, "The only man I will ever love must have hair as black as a raven, skin as white as the snow, and cheeks as red as the blood."
Very poetic.
The nursemaid accidentally reveals that there is exactly such a man in Conchobar's court, a young, phenomenal warrior named Noise, one of the 3 sons of Weasley.
Deirdre manages to sneak out, tracks down Noise, and basically forces him to elope with her. She places a geis on him to take her away.
Noise knows that if he takes the king's intended bride, it means a death sentence. But bound by the guise and her beauty, he agrees. He, along with his 2 fiercely loyal brothers, flee Ireland entirely. They cross the sea to Alba, which is modern-day Scotland, to escape Conchobar's wrath. They live there in exile for years, fighting as mercenaries.
But back in Ulster, the absence of the sons of Weasley is deeply felt. They were 3 of the greatest warriors in the province. Eventually, the nobles of Ulster go to King Conchobar and persuade him that it is a profound shame to lose such great defenders over a woman. They urge him to pardon the brothers and let them return home. Conchobar agrees. He says he forgives them.
To prove his good faith, Conchobar sends an envoy to Scotland to bring them back. And who does he send? He sends Fergus MacRoich, remember Fergus, the incredibly honorable veteran warrior who helped foster Cuchulainn.
Yes, the man of honor.
Fergus goes to Scotland and swears on his own personal honor that Noise, his brothers, and Deirdre will be absolutely safe if they return to Ireland. Trusting Fergus's honor, they agree to sail home.
But Conchobar was lying. His personal lust for Deirdre and his bruised, fragile ego completely override his sacred duty as a king to uphold peace and honor oaths.
The moment the sons of Weasley arrive at the royal court in Emain Macha, Conchobar springs a trap. He sends his mercenaries to ambush the guest house. A bloody battle ensues. Despite fighting heroically, Noise and his brothers are slaughtered. Conchobar murders them and takes Deirdre by force.
And she eventually commits suicide rather than remain with him or his executioner.
Right. It's totally devastating.
Now, analyze the systemic fallout of Conchobar's decision. He got what he wanted in the short term, but what did it cost the province?
It shatters the entire military infrastructure of Ulster. Because Fergus MacRoich, the most respected, powerful warrior in the province, realizes that his king used him as a pawn to break a sacred oath. Fergus's own honor was weaponized to commit murder. Fergus is utterly disgusted. He realizes the king has corrupted the back-end code. So Fergus, along with hundreds of his finest warriors, defects. He leaves Ulster entirely and travels to the rival province of Connacht. He joins King Ailill and Queen Medba.
Conchobar's private rivalry and failure of leadership escalates into a catastrophic political fracture. Because he broke the rules of honor and reciprocity, he caused a massive brain drain. He handed his greatest general directly to his greatest enemy. And this exact defection is what allows Queen Medba to successfully launch the Tain Bo Criomge, the cattle raid of Cooley, years later. Fergus is the one who guides Med's army into Ulster. The system operates on strict causality. Bad actions yield systemic collapse.
And those feedback loops can be even more literal and even more devastating. Which brings us to one of the most haunting stories in the book, Macha's Curse. We touched on this briefly when we mentioned the army of Ulster collapsing, but we need to dive deep into exactly how and why that happened.
The story of Cruiniuc and Macha is a masterclass in understanding how abusive power translates into ecological and military ruin.
Cruiniuc is a wealthy but widowed farmer living in Ulster. He has a nice house, but he is alone. One day, a mysterious, incredibly beautiful woman simply walks through his front door. She doesn't say a word. She walks to the hearth, stirs the fire, goes to the kitchen, prepares a meal, and then goes into his bedroom. This is Macha. She's an otherworldly woman, a goddess figure associated with sovereignty and horses. Cruiniuc accepts her as his wife, and immediately his farm becomes wildly prosperous. His wealth multiplies, but she makes him promise one thing. He must never speak her name or boast about her in the company of other men.
A classic Geis. A taboo meant to protect the fragile boundary between the human world and the other world. She brings prosperity, but it requires this discipline and silence.
Exactly. But Kruniak lacks discipline. Sometime later, King Conchobar holds a massive provincial assembly, a great festival with horse racing. Kruniak goes to the festival, leaving his wife, who is now heavily pregnant, at home. At the festival, the king's chariot horses race, and they win every single event. The crowd is cheering, declaring that nothing in the world is faster than the king's horses. Kruniak, who has been drinking, gets annoyed and yells out, "My wife can run faster than the king's horses."
The fatal boast. He breaks the guise. And King Conchobar, who is obsessed with his own supremacy, is furious. He demands that this woman be brought to the assembly immediately to prove this claim, or Kruniak will be executed.
Masha is dragged from her home and brought to the racing field. She is heavily 9 months pregnant. The pangs of labor are literally beginning. She stands before the king and the massive crowd of warriors. She begs them for mercy. She says, "Please, wait until my child is born. Do not force me to run in this condition." She appeals to the honor of every man there. But the king refuses. He says she must run against his chariot now or her husband dies. And the crowd of warriors just watches in silence. They do nothing to stop the cruelty.
It is the ultimate abuse of absolute power. The king, who is supposed to be the protector of justice, is actively tormenting the most vulnerable possible figure, a mother in labor, for the sake of his own ego, and the community is complicit by their silence.
Masha steps up to the starting line. The chariot is released, and Masha runs. She flies down the track, a blur of supernatural speed. She actually beats the king's horses to the finish line. But the moment she crosses the line, she collapses in agony, screaming, and gives birth to twins right there in the dirt in front of the horrified crowd. And in her agony, her supernatural nature erupts. She unleashes a curse on the men of Ulster. She says that from that day forward, whenever the province of Ulster faces its time of greatest peril, every grown man will suffer the debilitating, agonizing pangs of childbirth for 5 days and 4 nights.
And that curse holds for 9 generations.
Here's my analogy for this curse. This isn't just a witch throwing a fireball. This is like a systemic autoimmune disease.
Right.
The king, the head of the system, abuses his power to attack a vulnerable component of his own society. As a direct mathematical result, the system's defense mechanism turns on itself. The curse literally paralyzes the military infrastructure of Ulster.
Exactly. Years later, when Queen Med invades Ulster with the massive army of Connacht to steal the Brown Bull, the curse activates. The time of greatest peril has arrived. And all the great warriors of Ulster, Conchobar, Celtshire, Loghaire, they collapse in their beds, screaming in agony, completely stripped of their strength. They are utterly defenseless. The entire province is laid bare to the invading army. The only person left standing to defend the border is the teenager Cuchulainn, because he is technically not an Ulsterman by blood, so he is exempt from the curse. He has to fight the entire army alone. Myth here is not ornamental. It is a truth engine. It explains how social failure and political illegitimacy emerge directly from broken obligations. You break the social contract, the back-end code cripples your military.
Okay, this is all incredibly profound. It is a staggeringly complex, mathematically precise system of taboos, curses, environmental feedback, and social ledgers. But as I was reading Philip Freeman's book, a huge logistical question kept nagging at me.
I can guess what it is.
The ancient Celts didn't write any of this down. They didn't have printing presses. They didn't build vast libraries like the Romans or the Greeks. Julius Caesar explicitly noted that the Celtic Druids spent 20 years memorizing verses and considered it a sin to write their sacred knowledge down because writing weakens the memory and makes the sacred profane. So if it was entirely oral, how do we even know these stories? How did this incredibly delicate system survive the collapse of the very civilization that created it?
That is the magic of what we can call the long memory loop. The system persists precisely because it was eventually recorded by outsiders, and it proved resilient enough to adapt to those external lenses.
The filters we talked about at the beginning of the deep dive.
Yes. We have to look at the chain of transmission. First, we have the Greek and Roman writers. They encountered the Celts militarily and culturally, and they tried to understand them through their own classical Mediterranean lens. This led to a process called interpretatio romana, which is misdescription through substitution. Caesar looks at the complex Celtic god Lugus, sees that he's associated with travel, commerce, and skill, and Caesar says, I know who that is, that's Mercury. He looks at Taranis, the god of thunder and the wheel, and says, that's Jupiter.
He is translating the back-end code into a language the Romans can understand, but in doing so, he strips away the original syntax. He flattens it.
Exactly. But while the Romans were conquering Gaul and Britain, Ireland remained unconquered by Rome. The pure oral traditions survived there, maintained by the rigorous training of the Philid. And then, centuries later, the second major filter arrived, the Christian scribes.
Right. From the 7th to the 12th centuries, Christian monks in Irish monasteries undertook the massive project of writing down the oral traditions. But this must have created immense cognitive dissonance for them.
Oh, massive.
You have these devout, celibate Christian monks tasked with writing down stories about magical shape-shifting goddesses, severed heads, supernatural lakes of fire, and kings controlling the weather. How do they justify preserving pagan magic?
They did it by reframing the myths to fit within a Christian cosmology. They couldn't bring themselves to erase their own cultural history, so they baptized it.
Philip Freeman points out a hilarious example of this with the Liber Gabala Éireann, the Book of Invasions. This is the grand myth of how Ireland was settled by different magical races, like the Tuatha Dé Danann. The monks wanted to write it down, but they needed to connect it to the Bible. So they literally grafted Celtic mythology onto the Book of Genesis.
They really did.
They start the myth by claiming that the very first settlers of Ireland were led by a woman named Cessair, who was supposedly Noah's granddaughter, and she sailed to Ireland specifically trying to escape the biblical flood.
It is an incredible act of historical retconning. Or look at the goddess Brigid. In the pagan system, Brigid is a massively powerful triple goddess associated with fertility, poetry, healing, and smithcraft. The monks couldn't just tell the people to stop worshiping her. She was too deeply embedded in the agricultural and cultural cycle. So what happened? She was seamlessly blended into Saint Brigid of Kildare, a miraculous Christian nun. The stories of the saint heavily mirror the goddess. She is associated with sacred fires, she performs miracles involving dairy and fertility, and she even hangs her wet cloak on a sunbeam. The goddess didn't die, she just put on a nun's habit.
But the insight here, the real aha moment for me as I read this, is that despite these hostile or partial lenses, despite the Romans renaming the gods, despite the monks inserting Noah's granddaughter into the timeline, despite turning goddesses into saints, the structural logic of the Celtic system remains totally visible.
It's still right there.
The Gesa are still there on the page. The honor price mechanics are still there. The reciprocal link between the king and the land is still perfectly preserved. The preservation of myth through scribal transmission created a long memory loop that carried the core worldview of the civilization forward through Roman conquest, through the collapse of the Iron Age, and through total religious transformation.
Which brings us to the core thesis of this deep dive and the ultimate crisis in perception for the modern reader.
Let's lay it out. Let's synthesize all of this.
We, sitting here in the modern world, are heavily conditioned to treat Celtic mythology, or frankly any ancient mythology, as quaint folklore. We view it as primitive superstition, or simply as raw material to be mined for modern fantasy novels and video games. We read a story about a lake of fire protecting a swept hearth, or a warrior throwing a severed head to win a cut of pork, or a queen starting a war over a white bull, and we chuckle and think what wild, unscientific imaginations they had.
We look at the broken rocks of a ruin like Newgrange and we think, what a nice pile of stones. Good effort for cavemen.
Exactly. But that surface reading entirely obscures the truth. When you take the time to apply systems analysis to these texts, as we have done today, it reveals a remarkably coherent, highly functional, deeply sophisticated worldview. This was a society in which power, speech, ecology, law, and fate were inseparable. These stories encode institutional logic. They encode legal structures of restitution. They encode ecological parameters for leadership. And they encode profound metaphysical assumptions about the nature of causation and human responsibility.
The crisis in perception is not in the myths themselves. The myths are doing exactly what they were engineered to do. They are regulating behavior, auditing status, and preserving survival knowledge across generations. The crisis in perception is entirely in the external lenses through which we have learned to see them. We have been trained by our modern, categorized world to read a highly complex legal and ecological operating manual as if it were a children's comic book.
And once you take off those modern glasses and see the back-end code for what it truly is, you realize that the ancient Celts weren't just telling spooky stories around a fire to pass the time on a cold night. They were actively maintaining the equilibrium of their reality. They were reminding the king, through the story of Conair, to be just. They were reminding the warriors, through the story of Set and Connell, to respect the ledgers of honor. They were reminding the households, through the terrifying story of Nira, to rake the fire, lest the supernatural horrors of the Cid emerge from the dark to destroy the community.
It is a breathtaking, terrifying, and deeply beautiful way to view the world. Everything matters. Every word spoken has weight. Every action has an ecological reaction. Everything is connected. Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about your day.
I think I know exactly where you're going with this.
We've spent this time looking at the invisible back-end code of the ancient Celts. But if ancient Celtic myths were not just stories, but the actual governance system and operating framework for their reality, what are the invisible myths governing your reality today? What unquestioned stories about endless economic growth, or the infallibility of technology, or the absolute virtue of rugged individualism are acting as the Jessa, the binding, unwritten taboos of our modern world? What is the back-end code running your life, your society, and your ecology that you don't even realize is there? And more importantly, if the Celts were right about the feedback loops of reality, what happens when we break those taboos?
A powerful and necessary question to end on. We ignore the back-end code at our own peril.
Crisis in Perception examines how systems shape belief and how better tools help us see clearly.
This project is free and publicly accessible. If you'd like to support the time, tools, and research behind Crisis in Perception, you can become a supporter on Patreon.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer link in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.